Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin Christensen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program, Out of the Closets and Into the Streets. Early in July each year, from the mid-1980s through 2019, we have gathered with several hundred people in Washington Square Park, right across the street from the Newberry, for our Bughouse Square event. This park, Chicago's most boisterous and radical free speech space from the 1910s through the 1960s, was known by the nickname Bughouse Square. Bohemians, socialists, atheists, and religionists of all persuasions mounted soapboxes, spoke to responsive vocal crowds, and competed informally for attention and donations. The Newberry and community activists officially revived the spirit of the park with the annual Bughouse Square event in 1986. Last year and this year, we have opted to move Bughouse to a virtual space. Today, we are honored to welcome Tracy Boehm, Gary Chichester, and Timothy Stewart Winter, who will discuss queer culture in the 1970s Chicago and the importance of Bughouse Square in the emergence of LGBTQ+ activism in the city as it progressed toward today's more inclusive and intersectional movement. If you are not familiar with the Newberry Library, we support and inspire research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry's reading rooms are now open to readers with no appointment necessary Tuesdays through Fridays. Our Hanson Exhibition Gallery is open Tuesday through Saturday, and the Rosenberg Bookshop is open Wednesday through Saturday. You also can shop online at any time. Check out our website, newberry.org, for more information. During the program, please enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comments section if you are joining us on Facebook or YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond to your questions. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. If you'll join me, please, for a moment. Thank you. Tracy Boehm is co-publisher of the Chicago Reader and owner and co-founder of Windy City Times, the 36-year-old LGBTQ newspaper. A working journalist since 1984, she also is the author or co-author of 12 books on LGBTQ history, as well as producer of 4 films and creator of the That's So Gay LGBTQ trivia game. She has been inducted into the National LGBT Journalists Association Hall of Fame, the Association of Women Journalists Chicago Hall of Fame, and the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame. And she has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists Chicago. Gary Chichester is a gay rights activist and co-founder of the Chicago Gay Alliance, which created Chicago's first gay and lesbian community center. He has been involved with the Chicago Gay Health Project, the Gay Rights National Lobby, the Gay and Lesbian Coalition of Metropolitan Chicago, Gay and Lesbian Participation in Hands Across America, and many, many other organizations and movements. He also has been involved in the annual Gay and Lesbian Pride Parade since being present at the first march in 1970, which we'll learn more about in just a moment. Timothy Stewart Winter is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University, where he studies sexuality, gender, and modern US politics. His first book was Queer Clout, Chicago and the Rise of Gay Politics. It was awarded the 2017 John Boswell Prize by the Committee on LGBT History. His current book project focuses on Walter Jenkins, a longtime aide to Lyndon B. Johnson, who resigned from the White House staff in 1964 after being arrested on disorderly conduct charges. Dr. Stewart Winter also has published work in many academic journals and in the popular press. Now I will hand things over to Gary Chichester to get us started.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to first introduce the film that we kind of comes on, which starts from a film called Queerborn and Perversion, and it ends with the march from Bughouse Square down to the Chicago Civic Center, now the Daly Center. So these are clips from Ron Pajek's film Queerborn and Perversion.
28th, 1970. One of the most important days in the history of the American homosexuals' fight for freedom.
And we had a turnout of around 200 people, and we thought it was so successful. I thought maybe there'd be a dozen of us walking down the street. There were 200 people. That was just terrific.
On Saturday also, Chicago gay people were holding their demonstration. Mike Barta of Chicago Gay Liberation welcomed the crowd this way.
I want to welcome everybody here on behalf of Chicago Gay Liberation on this celebration day, part of Gay Pride Week. We're here because we're gay and we're proud that we are.
We met at Bughouse Square, and we had a little demonstration.
We had our rally at Bughouse Square, which was a known assignation park.
Henry Weinhoff, another gay liberation leader in Chicago, had this observation.
Like we're told we're supposed to live lives that are honest and that are free. But the more we try and live lives that are honest and free, the more we get fucked over. But we're not going to accept anymore. And if the shit hits us because we're not going to accept it anymore, that's okay, because we've taken the shit all of our lives anyway. And we can deal with it in an overt form as well as the kind of covert form we've had to take it. And I think we're the better for it.
In Chicago, as across the country, the gay movement has brought out many people who are new to marches and demonstrations. One of them put it this way.
I've never gone on a march before, and I'll be damned if I've ever been in a movement before. But all of a sudden, something that touched the corner of my life and its inner core began to have some kind of meaning. And I had to say that I've got to be out here no matter what.
It was exciting and at the same time scary. My mother had warned me, I had been warned that, people might come out and actually try to harm us because it was a big statement to be made at that time. We're openly gay and we want to be acknowledged as gay people.
And we did have police protection too. We had organized that. They organized the march and everything.
So there was a whole aura of fear and the unknown. We didn't know what people would do to us.
Before the Chicago march began to move from a North Side Park and down Michigan Avenue, Mike Barta reminded the crowd that all gay people must unite if freedom is ever to be attained.
About this park is let's get the hell out of here and let's stop being those fucking kind of homosexuals who are hiding and let's get on to Michigan Avenue.
We marched from Bughouse Square down Chicago Avenue to Michigan Avenue, down Michigan Avenue to Randolph Street, and Randolph Street to City Hall. But we were allowed one half of the sidewalk. Not the street. We had one half of the sidewalk. I was a parade marshal, and I counted the people. There were 128 people in that march, and we were all scared shitless.
People looked, stared, and there was very little heckling because people were so taken aback that there was a group of gay people there, even though it was about 80 or 100 people, 150 people, and we were all, ragtag hippies.
And, it was like just about everything we'd done that first year. We thought, wow, here we are. This is the first group of gay people coming together publicly in the city of Chicago. What a big story this is going to be, and people, for many people, boy, coming to that march was like a major turning point in their lives.
Since Illinois is one of the few states with no laws against homosexual conduct, some may wonder why gay people are so oppressed in the city of Chicago. David Goldman gave his observations on this.
Yes, I think this is basically true to the very hostile attitude of the police. And if most people remember how the people were treated at the Chicago Convention inside as well as outside, you can get sort of an idea to a mild extent how gay people are treated. Just imagine that treatment, only much more worse and on a continual basis. The laws really don't have much effect because the police use other harassment techniques.
When the Chicago marchers reached their destination at the downtown Civic Center, there were more speeches. Bill Dry said gays could be in the vanguard of those working to change American society.
Today is a really great day. I'm really proud to be gay. Right on. I also consider myself very lucky to be gay. Listen to all the rhetoric that explains what's wrong with this sexist race society. We know. Right on. Because we're gay, we can be the leaders in the revolution that is going to make this society a better place to live.
But when we got to City Hall, we joined hands and danced around the Picasso statue. And we felt like we had arrived.
You know, I expected the next day I was going to see all this in the papers. And the only thing I could find, there was like 2 lines on the second page of the Chicago Tribune, buried somewhere, just saying that there was a march of gay protesters or something like that. And that was it. That was it.
Well, we have a little bit of history right here. This is one of the flags you saw that was covering all aspects of that march. Bughouse Square has a history. There wasn't a lot of interesting, there wasn't newspapers at this time. So we learned how to find ourselves and contact each other through various aspects. In 1963, Life magazine did a particular expose on gays in Chicago and mentioned Bughouse Square. I learned about Bughouse Square from an article in the Playboy magazine. And then also in 1963, John Reike, author of City of Night, mentions it as part of his cross-country tour of the dark aspects of homosexuality and places that deal with homosexuals, in that period of time. A good read if you want history of that period. The aspect we decided on Bughouse Square because it was always basically it was a suppressed closet, and the whole idea of it was to go march out of the closet and into the streets. New York and LA and San Francisco all celebrated the day after. Chicago actually had the first march when it came to LGBT marches. They did that, I presume, I wasn't in on that conversation, but because we knew we were marching down Michigan Avenue, I would think that they were thinking that they figured they would get the tourists that were out shopping. Michigan Avenue and State Street were usually pretty quiet on a Sunday afternoon. So by moving the march to Saturday, we'd be able to gather more excitement, more people would notice us, which they did. It was really kind of interesting to see facial expressions when people realized this was a bunch of not only hippies, but gay hippies, and marching down. And of course, dancing around the Picasso statue was really something else. It came about, well, here's the march itself, people leaving the march, as you can see, the flags that are here. These flags mean a lot to me because they were all printed on my back porch. And the seams of attaching them, I borrowed a sewing machine from my upstairs neighbor, who just happened to be a vice cop for the Chicago Police Department. And I don't think he realized that he was helping the cause at that period of time. So there's flag, and it's flag's been around. I try to carry it at every parade and march that I can throughout 51 years now. And this is various shots of the march, people in the park, people along the march route, downtown Chicago. And this is a image of people dancing around the Picasso statue. The only thing missing here is the Picasso, I guess. But it was quite an afternoon, a very liberating feeling. We were people, after I kind of was brought up in a very conservative family, but I found myself in 1968 in Lincoln Park while the police were attacking the yippies over the war on Vietnam, et cetera, the demonstrations of the 1968 convention. And that kind of radicalized me. And that's when I heard later on that Stonewall was being flipped over. I had been there before, and a friend of ours lived in New York and actually gave us a call and said, "You won't believe what's happening now." And we went, "Well, they're rioting at Stonewall." So that was kind of exciting. And this was literally the first recognition of the Stonewall Rebellion back in 1970. And the first one because we did it on Saturday and the rest of everybody did it on Sunday. This is from 1975. This is me and my partner, Patrick, at the time, looking very official. And again, this was at the Civic Center at the time, now Daley Plaza. So that kind of is my introduction to what was going on at that time. I think as people who've been to a parade recently and see the millions of people in the streets and all over the world now, it's really, it was the start of something that who knew what was going to happen. Following year, as a member of the Chicago Gay Alliance, we actually applied for and got from Streets and Sanitation of the city a permit for a parade permit, which gave us the streets instead of walking on the sidewalks. The only thing we didn't really negotiate well is the fact that they didn't close the street and we only got half the street and they didn't remove the parked cars. So it went on from there. Now there's millions of people that go out, and for the first time, people can really go out and celebrate their pride through the marches and the demonstrations and the parades, and feel how good it is to be open and be oneself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Stewart Winter. I'm so honored to be in the company of all of you, and thank you to the Newberry Library, one of my favorite Chicago institutions. So in 1970, for the first and only time, Bughouse Square was the jumping off point for Chicago's Gay Pride March. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical context in which that came about. These activists, folks like Gary, were joining fellow marchers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Minneapolis, as well as New York, to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York's Greenwich Village. Now, the Stonewall Inn was not the first gay establishment where patrons fought back against a police raid, but it was a dramatic episode with patrons barricading some of the police inside the bar, terrified officers calling in the riot squad, and clashes lasting several nights. The real significance of Stonewall, though, lies in how gay activists turned it into a symbol. Like the revolutionaries who stormed the Bastille, they declared the dawn of a new era and wrote manifestos to tell others the good news. The Gay Pride March or parade was an invented tradition, if you will, one that gave concrete expression to the idea of coming out of the closet, disclosing one's homosexuality, no matter what the consequences, and becoming visible. And these were the central tenets of the movement for gay liberation that really flourished in 1969, 1970, 1971. And by marching publicly and proudly, queer Chicagoans pressed at the boundaries of the closet, staked a claim to city streets, and challenged the experience of concealment that was so central to gay life in post-World War II America. In April of 1970, this new group, Chicago Gay Liberation, held a rally in Grant Park. They got a near North Side gay club called the Normandy to allow gay people to dance, which was a big deal. And then now in June, with the endorsement of Mattachine Midwest, which was a 5-year-old activist group, they urged their supporters to attend a giant rally on Saturday, June 27th at 12 noon at Bughouse Square, which they called a site symbolizing the secrecy and repression of the past. And they talked about possibly burning real wooden closets there in the park. There's a moment in the video where you can see smoke. I don't know if they actually did that, but in the end, it was mostly about the speeches, flags, signs, and chants, as well as marching down Dearborn Street to Chicago Avenue, and symbolically leaving behind Bughouse Square and all it stands for. They also marched deliberately past the Chicago Avenue police station, carefully chosen symbol. In his new book on homosexuality in the American left, Love's Next Meeting, Aaron Lecklider points to Bughouse Square in Chicago, along with Union Square in New York and Pershing Square in LA, as places where sexual dissidents, artists, workers, and radicals had all converged in the sort of interwar period. By the late 1920s, there were as many as 35 gay bars in the near north side of Chicago and some 20,000 furnished rooms where, as the sociologist Harvey Zorbaugh put it, quick and intimate relationships spring up in the most casual way and dissolve as quickly and as casually. The near north side was also a major gay cruising area. Gay men cruised at the Michigan Avenue Bridge, the Oak Street Beach, the Thompson's Cafeteria at Michigan and Ohio, and a couple blocks west at Bughouse Square, the city's oldest park. There's a real tension about this place. On the one hand, it's a place where men could find one another. It's a place people knew how to get to, as Gary said, as a result of media coverage and press accounts. At the same time, it's a place of danger as well as pleasure, of police harassment. The late Bill Kelly, gay activist, said in a 2003 interview that in Bughouse Square, if the police found gay men in the park, they might charge them with public indecency, whether or not they were doing anything that could be considered public indecency. And Chicago had really very aggressive policing, even more so than in New York. An undercover cop in Chicago said in 1970, this is probably the peak of anti-gay and anti-left policing in Chicago, wrote in a report that gay activists would attend whatever left-wing demonstrations and activities there are, and if given the opportunity to speak, would describe the advantages of homosexuality and the discrimination shown to homosexuals. 1970 was sort of a distinctive and heady year, and gay activists really did leave Bughouse Square behind. The next year, the Pride Parade began at Diversey Harbor. In 1972, even further north at Belmont Harbor. But this represented a moment when gay people were staking a claim to city streets, demanding access on different terms than the ones they had come to know, and a level of visibility and collective ownership of the city that they had been denied in the post-war decades. And on that note, I will turn it over to Tracy.
Great, thanks so much, Tim. we're basically trying to shove 100 years of LGBTQ history at you in a short period of time. So I'll put some resources in the column and the chat after I talk a little bit. First, I'm going to talk about the Pride Parade and its growth, and then I'm going to look a little bit at each of the decades since the 1969 Stonewall riots. So the Pride Parade morphed really from that march you heard about into a parade in the 1970s. As Gary mentioned, the second year moved to East Lakeview, which was kind of called Newtown at the time. But the growth of the LGBT community wasn't in a vacuum. Many of the people in the LGBT movement, especially those willing to be more visible, were trained in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the farmers' rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War protests, and more. And so it was kind of a generation rife for this kind of thing to happen. And that certainly was the case in Chicago. So the parade's kind of progressed every year. More people would join them. In 1977, there was a protest against Anita Bryant, who was the orange juice queen, Florida orange juice spokeswoman, who was anti-gay and helped repeal a gay rights law in Dade County, Florida. She was coming to Chicago for a speaking engagement, and thousands of people showed up to protest her appearance in early June of 1977, which sparked a growth in the Pride Parade later that month. By 1978, there were 10,000 people counted. In 1982, there were 30,000 people, and that growth, it was in part due to showing up to protest and the neo-Nazis that were going to protest the Pride Parade. So a lot of gay people showed up to protest them. In 1984, it grew again because Mayor Jane Byrne who was actually the former mayor at that point, marched in the parade, rode in a car in the parade, and that caused more gay people to show up. Later, Mayor Harold Washington became the first sitting mayor to be in the Pride Parade. In 1986, 60,000 people. 1987, 75,000 people. By 1990, there were 100,000 people clocked at the Chicago Pride Parade. And by this time, also a lot of allies were showing up. It's more like a St. Patrick's Day parade these days, where half the people seem to be just allies and showing up for a good party. By 2000, 350,000 people were documented in some form or another by police and by the organizers were at the parade. 2003, 400,000, 2007, 450,000. And now in the last few years, it's basically seen to be around 1 million people that would show up at a parade that 50 years ago attracted numbers in the dozens. So what was happening in the 1970s in addition to that parade? So much more, right? All parts of the community started to grow and come out of like the darkness of pre-Stonewall. You had the sports leagues that were forming, the choral groups, the religious organizations for almost every denomination. You have the LGBT media coming out of the Mattachine Midwest newsletter, which was so critical. Then we started to have newspapers of more frequency and weekly newspapers like the Gay Crusader, Gay Life newspaper, Gay Chicago, the paper, later in the 1980s, Windy City Times, which I co-founded in '84. You had political activism that was happening. So you had candidates running for office as openly gay and lesbian people. You had Howard Brown Health Center, which is just an incredible institution still today, formed in the 1970s by gay doctors and medical students to deal with medical issues of the gay male community, especially sexually transmitted diseases. Very fortuitous they founded in the 70s as they were ready when HIV/AIDS hit in the 1980s. You also had Horizons Community Services start as a social service agency that later morphed into our community center, the center on Halsted today. You had other gay community centers. Gary Chichester was involved in the formation of one of them. You had a lesbian center. You had the cross-dressing laws that were overturned in the 70s. Still definitely police harassment and entrapment. You had bars that were owned or influenced by the mafia. And you had discrimination within the gay community, which still exists today based on race and other factors. But LGBTs of color were fighting back. They would do tests of carding at the bars, and one woman, Pat McCombs, and her friends fought back against extra carding at a lesbian bar and won. So 1980s was probably one of the most pivotal decades of our movement of the last 100 years. HIV/AIDS was first diagnosed in 1981. So 40 years ago. And it was later named AIDS, but they first saw what these cases that were first diagnosed among gay men, so it became known as gay-related immune deficiency, but later changed to HIV and AIDS. The response in Chicago was very similar to the coasts. It was just a little bit after, because the coasts got hit a little harder faster. So in Chicago, the whole movement grew in part as a response to the fact that the nation was ignoring this war that was happening within its borders. So Chicago's community grew by leaps and bounds. Men and women came together to work on this. People of all backgrounds came together to fight against this. And whether that was someone feeding someone a meal, or visiting them in the hospital, or acting up and fighting back in the streets, there was a tremendous response in the 1980s to the AIDS epidemic, which also paralleled the push for a gay rights bill in Chicago. It had been introduced first in the early 1970s by Alderman Kelly, and then it was passed later under Eugene Sawyer, after Mayor Washington had passed away. That gay rights push was an incredible effort on behalf of the community, and it later led to other changes in county and state laws. And then finally, in the 1980s, one of the bigger influences was the 1987 March on Washington. Victor Salvo of the Legacy Project and Julie Vallone, who recently passed away, co-chaired the Chicago contingent. And when people returned to Chicago from the March on Washington, the community was forever changed. People started organizations, started running for office, campaigns were energized. Dr. Ron Sable ran for 44th Ward Alderman, and he had come the closest anybody had to winning. And that really empowered the community to keep fighting to get an elected seat at the table, which happened in the next decade, the 1990s. The first openly gay elected official for a major office in Illinois was Tom Keola in early 1994. And then we had subsequent many other people, like our first openly gay state rep, Larry McKeon, and many others. You had the fight for inclusion in the mainstream. So the Bud Billiken Parade, a very important parade on the south side of Chicago. LGBTs tried to have a contingent in there. They did a double-blind test and they were refused. They fought thanks to the newly opened Lambda Legal Office in Chicago, and they won the right to march openly in the 1993 parade. A very important victory in that decade. There was a rise of a lot of LGBT groups of color in the 1990s in Chicago, many of them still with us today. But there were also negatives like the violence and murders that were happening both locally and nationally. The Matthew Shepard murder and that was one of the most visible, but in Chicago, we also experienced a lot of violence as well. So there were many Take Back the Night type marches to reclaim our spaces. And then finally, in the 2000s, we've really seen an incredible leap forward in our movement in the last 20 years. We've also seen a huge rise in the transgender community, which obviously had always existed and was critical to the Stonewall riots and many other subsequent parts of the movement. But more and more people were living openly and using their names and photos in the media as trans individuals beyond performers and other people who had always been out. Now we had many more activists, and in Chicago have a tremendous core of transgender activists fighting for their rights. They're probably among the most vulnerable in our community, as well as those who identify as non-binary and other types of gender expansive terms. We also had the Gay Games in Chicago in 2006, which brought 12,000 athletes from over 70 countries around the world to Chicago for our own kind of Gay Olympics. And that was also transformative for our sports leagues and visibility in the mainstream from Chicago all the way to Crystal Lake and other suburbs that welcomed the gay community. Eventually, they were convinced to welcome the gay community to their borders. And you had, after the early fits and starts of gay community centers, finally in 2007, you had the Center on Halsted, which had morphed from Horizons Community Services into this now long-standing gay community center on Halsted Street. So that was a Herculean task that involved many different government and private citizens to build it. And now we're looking at community on the south side is looking to build a community center in part funded by state funds. So there's so much happening now in the movement. It's hard even to keep track of if you're paying attention every day. Also, obviously, openly gay elected officials. 26, 27 years ago, Tom Keola gets elected, and now 2 years ago, we elected an openly gay mayor in the city of Chicago. Agree with her politics or not, it's an incredible short window of time our progress has happened in. And part of that, most of that really is due to the movements that came before, as well as the openly gay people in a pre-Stonewall era that risked their lives, their livelihoods, and much more to bring us to where we are today. So I'm happy to be joined by Gary and Tim. We'll talk for a few minutes and then take questions from the public. Well, while we're waiting for Gary, Tim, I wanted to ask you what kind of brought you into writing about Chicago's politics as a younger generation, how you kind of view the community that Gary lived through longer than any of the three of us, and then me next, right? Like what brought you to it and what was your experience with it?
I was in grad school in Chicago, and I didn't really know much about Chicago's queer history at all. And there was a period around 2004 where the backlash over same-sex marriage really pushed me to become very much more interested in political history and the history of the gay movement. And I realized there hadn't really been academic studies of queer politics in Chicago. And I wanted to look at sort of the relationship between the movement on the one hand and electoral politics on the other. So, I mean, I knew I wanted to study queer history, but I sort of was pulled into the political angle on it. Tracy, I know you started out as a journalist. You come from a family of journalists. What led you to found the Windy City Times?
Well, I started at Gay Life newspaper in May. Gay Life. No, I started there in '84. And it was owned by Chuck Renslow, who Gary worked for and knew very well as well. That's how I kind of met Gary. So it was located next to a bathhouse that Chuck owned. And it was next door to a leather bar that Chuck owned. And I got a pretty quick orientation into gay male life very quickly. And I had found my home so fast and quickly, having graduated with a news editorial degree in journalism in 1984. I knew my path was very narrow to still being a journalist and being openly gay. I only was aware of one other openly gay journalist in the country, Randy Schiltz at the time. I'm sure there were others, but there were very few, a handful of openly gay journalists with using their real names working in mainstream media. And so my journalism professors warned me I wasn't going to have an opportunity to be that. But my mother, who was a journalist at an alternative paper herself, said, there's a gay newspaper in town. I actually had gone away to school for 4 years. I didn't realize there was such a thing as a gay press. So I just latched onto it. I said, I know how to run the typesetter. I can take photos. I can develop film. I can deliver newspapers. Just let me be here. So I moved up to managing editor within a year because people were leaving, and they didn't stay long in the gay press because it was very low pay, no benefits, and horrible hours. But I thrive on that. So, and then in the next year, many of us left to found Windy City Times. I was on the fence about it, but in part it was because Chuck Renslow was seen as too influential because he also was involved in politics and all these businesses, and the community didn't see that the paper could be objective about the community. But I didn't really have an issue. Chuck never censored me. I was 22 years old. And people, I was convinced to do it. And Windy City Times did become something very different, but my gut was right. So I left and started my own gay paper in 1987, and then eventually bought Windy City Times back from my co-founder in 2000. But the journey has been complicated, but the through line is that I wanted to tell stories about my community. And in the 1980s, in the middle of a war zone, it was triage every day, trying to make sure the stories were told, because the mainstream was either not telling them or telling them horribly. And we needed to be the voice of our community in a pre-internet way that was the only place people could find out what was going on. And what we saw is our facts about who we were.
Chuck was amazing when it came to mentoring all types of people. Chuck really molded me into my activism, and he he did it because he liked to be a mentor to people and help them along. The amazing man.
Yeah, Chuck Renslow founded International Mr. Leather. He had dozens of businesses. He was kind of a serial and parallel entrepreneur. Founded the first gay men's leather bar in the country in the late 1950s in Chicago. But he also, just like Jim Flint, who just celebrated his 80th birthday, founded the Baton in 1969, and it is still going strong. Those two had to do a lot of things to survive. They had to pay off the mafia. They had to pay off the cops. In order to be openly gay businessmen, they had to play the Chicago way that was made even harder by being openly gay and serving a gay clientele. Owen Keenan and I wrote biographies of both of those men, and also Vernita Gray, who was featured in the film that you saw, Queer Born and Perversion. Chuck and Vernita passed away a few years ago, but Jim is still with us. So go to the Baton Show Lounge if you want to live in that LGBT Chicago history.
I had a chance to interview Chuck Renslow also in his office, you know, in the front of the bathhouse. And he said during the interview, you know, that he was very used to not talking about the things he did, like pay off the police. And so, you know, I might have to really push him because he'd had for decades, just like, you know, learned how to survive, not disclosing certain kinds of things. Which I really appreciated. And he, you know, he was very forthcoming, but it was a really vivid moment for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to put some, I hope I'm going to be able to put some resources here as well. One of the things, I don't know why it's not copying and pasting, but the Legacy Project in Chicago is a wonderful walking history museum on our pylons on Halsted Street that would be highly recommended, as well as the Gerberhardt Library. Both of those have a tremendous amount of resources on our history that you can find. There's so many different organizations you can start with if you're in Chicago or nationally, as well as Tim's book and many of the books that Owen and I have written if you want to find more information about our history.
The Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame, Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame.org, is a good read when it comes to history, going back to Henry Gerber back in the 20s and forward. An amazing, just very Chicago based, and contributions that were made to the city by LGBT folks. And so I'd recommend maybe viewing that as well. And then there's also Chicago Gay History is a oral history that Tracy put together 10 years ago.
Yeah, it was a companion to the Out and Proud in Chicago film that WTTW did, which sometimes airs. It aired this June, and it's a pretty incredible document of many people who have since passed away. Just like Ron's film, it's so great to see those films documented those people before they passed away. I'm sorry, I'm pasting these one at a time in here because the chat isn't letting me do more than one.
Someone wrote, there was a question about how Chicago is distinctive or different from other cities like New York, LA, San Francisco. I wrote a piece about that exact question that I just put into the chat, but there's a lot of questions.
Let me see if I can give you some of them. You've mentioned some, but I'd like to ask all three of you about other individual people in the movement who inspired you. Could each of you say a couple of words about that?
We were talking about Vernita Gray earlier, and during the time when all this started with the gay liberation movement in Chicago, a lot of it was done on university campuses. So she actually started a phone line, which was done FBI List, which became kind of famous during that time, where she got all kinds of calls. You had Henry Weemhoff, who's also featured in the film. He was part of the University of Chicago group. You might be able to talk to that, Timothy, if, you know, others that were part of that early group. Michael Barta, all kinds. But Renita was an amazing individual. Again, Hall of Fame, she's on there with her biography. So.
Yeah, I would say that there's a few pillars of the community that when I came out as a, working as a journalist in '84, attorney Renee Hanover was one of those diehard, openly gay attorney, one of the first openly lesbian attorneys in the country. She helped gay men in cases. She worked with attorney Pearl Hart, who they took on some very interesting mainstream cases on immigrant rights and racial justice cases, as well as LGBT stuff. So many of the people that were working back then were working on many parallel movements. They didn't just single issue focus on gay stuff. But Renee Hanover was a real incredible attorney, pivotal cases that she worked on. She also fought against the discrimination in our gay bars. She was the attorney that helped Pat McCombs fight against the racial carding at a lesbian bar. And she was just this great curmudgeonly person that I loved just being with and soaking in the life that she led. She moved to Chicago in the 90s and unfortunately later had dementia, and what a incredible mind to have lost before she did her own autobiography. I'm hoping that her family or somebody will continue her legacy, her archives at the Lesbian History Archives in New York City.
One of my favorite memories of Renee was one of the first public dances. The universities would hold dances, but they would, because it was illegal through definition of the law at the time. So they were always held on university campuses under the, I always say the, apron strings of the university. So we were protected. So they got to be too big for the universities that were holding these dances. So they took over a real rundown, the Chicago Coliseum on South Wabash, just a hole in the wall. If you thought that the amphitheater was disgusting, you should have been down at the Coliseum. But here we knew that we heard that the police were all there ready with enough paddy wagons to take everybody in. And there was this tiny little lady, Renee Hanover, who was kind of organizing the volunteer lawyers that were there and made the event a success. And she just was such a little powerhouse.
Thank you. We have a question from Eileen asking if you can comment on the Daley administration's relationship with the community.
Which Daley?
Good question. I would, let me read the rest of the question. Ethnic Irish Americans in Chicago have historically been blue, pro-union, pro-worker solidarity, but have also evidenced a profound conservative streak. And St. Patrick's Day parades have been hostile to gays marching. As a corollary, given the considerable presence of Irish Americans in the police force, could you reflect on that dynamic? I guess either or both would work, right?
Well, I personally never had an issue, never got to really know Richard J. Kind of just before my time, but I remember him from the '68 convention and how he was the king at the time. His son, Richard M., eventually became mayor and had a good rapport with the LGBT community. As the co-chair for the Chicago LGBT Hall of Fame, he was always there to help present and award the inductees. And he really took an interest, and I really respected him for spending the time that mayors since have not done or didn't do. But he was really, I thought, really good for the LGBT community in a Chicago way, and by getting that exposure, you help, that kind of spreads. It's like when you have people of color and the leaders, and Jesse Jackson, can help turn the tides on thoughts by just being inclusive.
I think Richard M. Daley kind of learned to I mean, he he basically came to understand LGBTQ people as a potential voting bloc, as people who might vote for him, who had their own needs, concerns, demands, and that sort of process, almost on the model of the kind of old ethnic politics of Chicago, right? So that the arc from Daly to Daly is just a massive gulf. Though Chuck Renslow was a precinct captain under Dick Daly before Daly's passed away, the only openly gay precinct captain in the Daly machine, but really an outlier.
Well, Chuck was really good about kind of making show numbers. He did his annual kind of birthday party, which was always considered Chicago's white party, and it started out in his house with maybe 100 guests or so, until it finally went to the ballroom at Navy Pier. And his whole thing is wanting to show the numbers that he could turn out for the power. The same thing as the marches and parades. When you're showing as many people as recently, those are numbers which politicians tend to look at.
Makes sense. So we have a question from David. Do you all think that North Halsted, one word, and Andersonville will remain intact as LGBT centers?
I think the difference between the past and now is that more LGBT people own the properties, or the nonprofits own the properties, than in past decades when the movement moved more quickly because they were priced out of it or forced out of it, et cetera. So I do think that it's more permanent, but it's been so clear since the very beginning that LGBT people are everywhere, from Homewood to Wilmette to Lyle, and the centers are where people gather, and maybe some people own, but the vast majority of the community has never been in any one space. It's just these concentrations, and they feel more permanent now. Nothing's ever permanent, but they definitely feel far more long lasting because of the ownership stake in the nonprofits that have anchored there.
Thank you.
I tend to agree with Tracy.
Yep. I have a couple of questions that I want to sort of combine. One is, all of you have talked about feeling afraid or about different kinds of danger or lack of safety or things like that. And so the question is for all of you, what is the situation for LGBTQ plus people today? Is that sense of fear still pervasive? What has gotten better and what hasn't? Someone else says, have you seen an improvement in mental health resources for the community over time?
I actually think that there aren't, the improvement in mental health services is not very dramatic. Luckily, we do have a center in Halsted, which was Horizons, which provided that. So there are certainly some, and a starting point, and also more openly gay therapists and psychologists and things like that. But it is a real, very small part of it. And the changes that happened, obviously, in the professional associations in the early 1970s were critically important to how people were diagnosed. But there's still issues around transgender individuals related to mental health care and physical care. So I do think that there's a long way to go there. In terms of the violence, I think that we're more easy targets. I think that our LGBT youth are more vulnerable than ever before because they are coming out younger than ever before. A lot of us came out in college or later. Many of them are coming out at 8, 9, 10 years old and gender different in age 5 or 6. That puts them in a hugely vulnerable place. So I think we have to remember that things don't always improve. Sometimes because of the acceptance at the adult level, the youth feel more empowered to come out, and they need us more than ever to shelter them in this storm of homophobia and transphobia that they're living in.
I think the United States has the most visible gay movement in the world, and also the most visible and active anti-LGBTQ movement in the world. And the anti-trans violence is really endemic and worse worse than when I was a kid.
When it comes to health factors, I remember going back in the day when if your name was turned in as a contact for gonorrhea or syphilis or venereal disease, the epidemiologist would come out and they'd send you to the public health clinics to be tested. The only thing wrong with that, that no one knew how to test you. So literally, if you ever had to go into that situation, you'd have to talk and tell the doctor, you should look there, you should look there, and you should look there. You know, you're telling them. And that's how the Howard Brown got started. They had medical students who were openly gay, but it was hard to get a job if you were openly gay as a doctor. So they started their own clinics. And that's how Howard Brown got started, with being the clinic that took care of LGBT folks. The Lesbian Cancer Project is also involved with that. You know, we had to take care of ourselves during the AIDS crisis. If it wasn't for the lesbian community, you know, who knows where the gay men would be? They'd all be 6 feet under. They really took charge. It really brought the community together.
Mm. We are just about out of time. So I want to thank all of you, Tracy, Gary, and Tim, for this fascinating and moving look at this such an important aspect of the history of our city and our nation.
Who would have known we would have been talking to the Newberry Library on this particular subject back in 1970?
You know, I got to hand that to you.
Amazing. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tracy. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel soon. Newberry programs remain free and open to the public thanks to the support and generosity of our donors. During this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please consider making a gift today. You can do so online at newberry.org/give. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to some in-person public programs at the Newberry in the fall, fingers crossed, though we will deliver some virtual-only events in the fall as well. This is our last event for the summer, but check our website, newberry.org, in mid-August for information and registration links for September programs. Thank you.